There are also risks that arise from the home country. And the home country in this case is, let's say you are a US business going to another country, then the US would be the home country, and the country you go to would be the host country. So the US, for example, has a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of 1977, which made it illegal to offer bribes to foreign parties. But the act may harm actually US firms because their competitors are not constrained like this. So let me explain what this means. If you are a US based company like Shell, doing business in a country like Africa, trying to drill for oil, and your other competitors are from places in Germany or Italy, right? In Germany or Italy or in the US, within the country, you're not supposed to bribe anybody. It's illegal. But Germans and Italians do not have restrictions on whether they can bribe uh, organizations in other countries. They do not have any such laws not holding them up to the standard of not bribing in another country. But the US does. It's called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Essentially, this is saying not only shall you not be corrupt within the US, but you're not allowed to practice certain things like bribery even in other countries. And so this makes it a lot harder sometimes for the US to do businesses in places like Africa or India, where bribery is a means to get ahead. This can also inoculate US firms from future scandals, like Italian firms have gotten caught in. But this is definitely a country risk that is arising from your own country, which is a home country. There's also something called extraterritoriality, which is sometimes a country can choose to apply their home country laws on another organization. So for example, Microsoft operates in several different countries, and Microsoft, excuse me, for the longest time was and probably still is the primary operating system that's being used in most workplaces, right? So in lots of ways, it had a monopoly in the market, and it was even the practices it was trying to pursue was to shut down competition so that it could stay number one and it could stay a monopoly. And the European Union actually has anti-monopolistic laws that it levied against Microsoft and went after them. Whether or not Microsoft was operating in their own country, they used that home country rule on Microsoft. So these are risks that organizations undertake when they go to another country to do business. If a country or a government decides that they don't want their firms offshoring or taking jobs or money to another country, then governments can intervene by imposing trade and investment barriers that benefits certain interest groups such as domestic firms, industries, labor unions. So, for example, if the labor union for steel is very, very strong in the US, and if they bargain with the government, they lobby with the government hard enough, they can create a situation where maybe US companies cannot buy steel from anywhere but US manufacturers. That has happened in the past. Or maybe buy oil from anywhere but US oil makers or manufacturers. Those are the examples of governments forcing companies in their country to buy local. Such intervention obviously alters competitive landscape because now you're, as a company, being forced into restrictive choices. You do not have the option of going to where it's the cheapest and the best or the most abundant. You have to work with what you have. And therefore, if you cannot manufacture something at the cheapest cost, you have to spend more to obtain the raw goods and materials. Then you pass off a lot of those higher costs to your consumers, and the cost for everything goes up. So this will be made clear in examples to follow, like the steel example I'm going to give in a second. So protectionism happens when basically there's a national economic policy that restricts free trade, In other words, the government is trying to protect its own country in terms of economically. It's usually intended to actually raise revenue or protect domestic industries from foreign competition. However, it often backfires. So this is an example of protectionism that happened in the US. In the steel industry, the Bush administration imposed tariffs on imports of foreign steel to protect US steel manufacturers from foreign competition. This was aimed to give US Steel time to restructure and revive itself. But what ended up happening was steel started costing more. So any anything that required steel, like washing machines or dishwashers or any kind of appliances, it started having an increased production cost. And so cars, appliance makers, they all had increased cost, and therefore they had to now charge higher prices. So it became very expensive. Their products became very expensive. They became less competitive than their competitors from around the world who was able to sell it a lot cheaper because they were able to manufacture it a lot cheaper. So essentially, when we force companies within our country to only buy and sell within the country, we are really tying their hands in terms of how profitable they could be. And then we are also really restraining how many options consumers within that country have. The steel tariffs didn't really work out, and they were removed in 2 years. This also happened in the auto industry. US automakers were facing stiff competition from Japanese car manufacturers that were taking over the industry, and so the US government tried to protect US car makers. In the 80s, what they did is they imposed voluntary export restraints, also quota, which is basically quotas on how many foreign cars from Japan could be imported. And they tried to do that to help or insulate the US auto industry from foreign competition. Unfortunately, what ended up happening is because the US companies were being protected, they kind of got spoiled. It's a little like, if you don't let your child go out and fail in the world, they'll never learn from their failures and they'll never get better. They'll think that they do everything correctly, even if they don't. So Detroit automakers basically had less of an incentive to improve quality, design, overall product appeal, because the laws were such that people within the country were more or less being forced to buy US cars rather than Japanese cars, because Japanese cars were so much more expensive and so hard to find in the 80s. So Detroit's ability to compete basically in the global auto industry weakened, because if you don't improve and don't stay competitive, then even if you are selling some cars within your country, in the larger world, you've now fallen behind from your competition, and nobody's buying your cars. And again, you can't just sell in one country. If you're a big organization, you have to have the world markets be buying your cars or your products in order to be competitive. So again, this protectionism in the auto industry ended up really hurting the auto industry ultimately. And when the protectionism was removed, Detroit basically collapsed, and GM, Chevrolet, they all had to reinvent themselves and to become super competitive again with the rest of the cars in the world. So protectionism really doesn't help. Consequences of protectionism is it ends up reducing supplies of goods to buyers. You have price inflation, you have reduced variety, fewer choices available to buyers, you have reduced competitiveness in the industry, various adverse, which is bad, unintended consequences. So, for example, you may have not thought that by protecting your own country's automakers that you were ultimately hurting them globally, but that's what might end up happening. Your home country dithers and other countries race ahead. And remember, if you're not the only one that can protect, right? So if a US decides to start protecting everything within their borders, other countries can get upset with the US and also start doing the same. And we actually saw this happen recently with the Trump administration, where he was imposing tariffs on, it started with China and certain countries in Europe that he was upset with. And then those countries imposed Canada, and then those countries started imposing those tariffs right back. And what ended up happening is a bunch of farmers in Middle America started suffering because of these tariffs. So if we start protecting, other countries might retaliate by also protecting, and we are actually the world's largest exporter. A lot of our economy relies on other countries buying the stuff that we're selling. So if other countries get upset with us because we're not buying their stuff, then they might stop buying our stuff as well. So we have actually a huge stake. We, as in the US, has a huge stake in keeping markets open. So far we've talked about manufacturing. Let's talk about service jobs. Why should we outsource service jobs? One is you can have cheap labor, technological advances. All of that allows you to outsource service jobs. So again, think call center as a service, right? And if you have a bunch of cheap engineers in India who can do software, call centers, and all you need is the computers and an internet and phone systems, then that's pretty easy to set up. So technological advances, cheap labor, all of it allow us to outsource jobs. It also allows us to set up a 24/7 customer service environment, such that even if you have call center operations or employees that work in the US during the day, it's probably harder to find somebody to work all night. So when this part of the world goes to sleep, the another part of the world wakes up. And so if that other part of the world you had employees now waking up and handling calls coming in the middle of the night, you have now a 24/7 work cycle. So if sometimes we also don't have the talent that we need. Maybe in the US there's a severe lack of engineering and math skills. A lot of people are choosing not to do degrees in science, technology, engineering, and math. And so countries like China and India that are very strong in those technical skills will end up getting a lot of those jobs, simply because that skill might not exist in the home country. Okay, so back to this little graphic. We've talked about the country risk. Let's talk about cross-cultural risk, and this really shows up in the services sector. So trade in the services is less than trades in products. However, services is getting internationalized rather rapidly, and FDI is a very, very common entry strategy in this space. The most rapidly internationalizing services are things like lodging, retail, construction, banking, insurance, publishing, IT, travel, transport. For those of my students who are from the Caribbean, they know that a lot of the islands, the infrastructure like roads and highways, hospitals are getting built from countries like China. That would be an example of China investing in the services sector of another country. Because of close interactions between service providers and consumers, the culture of a country really strongly affects services, especially when there's huge cultural distance between the home country and the host country. So, for example, if the US is trying to do some work in a totally foreign part of the world like China, obviously the laws couldn't be more different. Between the two countries, the culture couldn't be more different between the two countries, and so there could be lots of misunderstandings, a lot of perceived disrespect, a lot of lost in translation type stuff happening. And so these are all cross-cultural risks that we undertake when we do international business. There are also natural checks and balances to offshoring. And what this means is, let's say you say, hey, you know what, the topic for today is US offshoring and outsourcing. It says outsourcing, but I'm going to call it offshoring. Is US outsourcing or offshoring a good strategy, yes or no? So if you think it's a terrible strategy and you think that, hey, offshoring shouldn't happen because home country people are losing jobs and whatnot, remember that there are definitely natural checks and balances to even offshoring. As countries do businesses with each other, the cost of living differences start to disappear. So, for example, cost of living was very, very cheap in China and India. But the more economically successful these countries have gotten, the cost of living has become almost equivalent to the US. Places like Singapore, Hong Kong, cost of living is equivalent to the US. So, salaries overseas will also keep rising over time, especially the more economically viable those countries get. Also, when the US companies go to another country to do business, they are trying to set up operations in some of the most expensive real estate areas in those countries. So, for example, if you're going to India, you want to set up operations in New Delhi or Mumbai, some of the biggest cities, and cost of living over there is equivalent to like comparable to any major city in the US. So, if you're going to another country thinking, hey, it's going to be a lot cheaper there, it might not be. So that might be another check and balance, natural check and balance to companies not wanting to undertake offshoring. Not also remember, not every job can be offshored. Indeed, actually only a small percentage of jobs can actually get offshored. The whole coronavirus pandemic made us realize how some jobs are essential jobs that need to keep being done in person, right? Those jobs, it would be almost impossible to actually offshore them. Um, Jobs that could be done completely over technology could potentially be offshored, but that's not every job out there. So people who go, all our jobs are leaving, that's just not the case, because that's not possible. Toyota, Honda, etc. choose to set up factories in the US, even though they could have offshored factories to a cheaper location and then imported cars. They do so because they want to not have to pay the tariffs of importing products that are manufactured in another country to the US to sell it over here. Plus, they want to have a reputation of sort of made in America. Toyota, Honda, they were all suffering from a branding of these are Japanese cars, let's not buy them, especially if people had an anti Japanese or anti foreign mentality. And so when the entire manufacturing and operations moved to the US, they are no longer seen as a foreign car. And people are a lot more open to purchasing those vehicles. Also, new jobs tend to get created in the home country. Even if some jobs leave, it gets replaced with another economy. So, for example, IT was not really a sector or an economy with the impact that it has right now 20, 30 years ago. It was Silicon Valley wasn't as big as it is now. And now some of the most money in technology or biggest jobs are all over there. So even though some jobs leave, other jobs get created to replace it. This doesn't mean that the person who lost their job can easily find another job. They probably have to be reskilled and retrained. But generally speaking, when lower level manufacturing type jobs start exiting the country, there are more higher paying jobs available within that home country, but it does need certain skills or degrees. Okay. So if we were in class, I would have asked you at this point, what do you guys think? Do you think overseas outsourcing, which is offshoring, is a good US business strategy, yes or no? If you think that, it is a good business strategy, then we definitely know there are some negatives arising from offshoring, such as job loss, backlash. So what are the ways to combat these negatives arising from offshoring? Can companies, for example, do what Honda and Toyota did, which is move all the manufacturing back to the US to not be seen as a foreign car? Could the US try to explain to its customers that, hey, if we made this product in the US, it would cost so much more, and that's why we have to do it somewhere else? Could the US take all the people who lost their jobs because their job went to another country and reskill them, retrain them so that they can be making more money in the jobs that are getting created, the higher level jobs that are getting created within the US? So these are ways to overcome maybe some negatives arising from offshoring. What are some of the alternatives to offshoring or overseas outsourcing? One of them is trying to retain the jobs in the US by finding alternative cheap labor. So, for example, there are lots of people who are not able to do a regular job. They have to stay at home because they have to take care of children or elders. And so if you can tap into those people and hook them up with a computer and internet connection, then you can maybe for a lot cheaper than actually setting up a call center, have a network of people who are working from home handling your call center service issues, but they all live and work within the US. So that's one way to probably cheaply do it. And that's an alternative of sending the job abroad. Okay, what kinds of jobs are less, also prisons, for example? Lots of people are sitting in prisons and they earn very, very little money. They don't even earn minimum wage. So, teaching them some skills, having them do some jobs that we would have sent to another country might be a way to do it. Victoria's Secret does that. They manufacture a lot of their stuff in the prisons in the US rather than send it to another country. What kinds of jobs are less likely to be outsourced? I would have asked this question simply to have you pause and think about, if you don't want to lose your job to offshoring, then what kinds of jobs should you be present in or have skills and degrees for? And so this would be to encourage you to not think about just doing lower level manufacturing type jobs that could be easily replaced by a robot or be offshored, but try and get degrees like you are working on right now, to get higher level jobs that are not so easily offshored. All right, with that, we are done with this discussion. Please feel free to email me if you have any questions. Thanks, guys.